Hello. We've just heard the story of David and Bathsheba. Often we only hear one side of the story. So Bathsheba, she was probably aged between 16 and 19. So let's listen to her story. My beloved husband Uriah was away at battle for our king and Israel. He's such a loyal and brave man, but I've been very worried about him. The other day, I went to our enclosed courtyard for the cool refreshment of bathing as part of the ceremonial purification ritual after my menstrual period. Suddenly, I realised King David was looking at me. I was so embarrassed and ashamed. I quickly covered myself up and rushed inside. Then there was a knock at the door. I was being summoned by the king. I was so nervous. What would he say? But he was kind and complimented me on my looks. And then he touched me and I felt on edge. What was he doing? And as he continued, I realized. I told him I love my husband, Uriah. But the king said, "Your husband isn't here. I am. So let's enjoy ourselves." I tried to resist, but I really had no choice. You can't say no to the king. And then he raped me. He wasn't violent, but it was still rape. I went home feeling dirty and sick inside. I knew I could face the death penalty if anyone found out. I stayed indoors so no one would see me. I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about my beloved Uriah, fighting for our king who had betrayed him, and I had betrayed him. A few weeks later, I was horrified to discover I was pregnant. What could I do? When I next saw the king, I told him. At first, he suggested it could be Uriah's baby, but I explained that was impossible. So the king thought for a moment, and then he said he would bring Uriah back from the battle. I wasn't sure whether I was pleased or not. How could I face my husband when I knew what had happened? But I also longed to see him, so I accepted the king's solution. But my dear Uriah, he's so loyal to the king and to Israel that he wouldn't stay with me because all he wanted to do was to return to the battle. In the end, the king let him go. I prayed for the battle to end quickly so Uriah would come back home again. But God did not answer my prayer as my beloved Uriah was killed. My world came to an end. I was alone, except I wasn't, because the king moved me into the palace as his wife, and there was no escape. Well, that's a bit different, isn't it? But this is a story of the abuse of power. And it didn't just happen 3,000 years ago. It's still happening now. People with power, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, people with power write the history. Traditionally, that's been men, white, middle or upper class, educated and with money. You see, all history is selective from a specific point of view. Let me give you a personal example. When I returned from South Africa during apartheid and the state of emergency in the 1980s, I told my family and friends what it was like living there. And one friend said to me, "Oh, it's so good to have a true, unbiased view." I said, "No, you're getting my view through the eyes of a white woman." And another example occurred to me. Once I went with my brother on his motorbike into Plymouth city centre. I said to him, gosh, it's busy today. People keep bumping into me. And he said, no, it's because we're wearing leathers. He added, if I was wearing my naval uniform, no one would bump into us. That day, I experienced the world very differently. So there is power in your gender, the colour of your skin, your health, your education, your ability, your job, your status, your sexuality, your religion. David had power, God-given power, and he abused that power. God hates that. God challenges that. God is intolerant of the abuse of power. God never abuses his power to harm others. Jesus always sides with the underdog, the marginalized, the excluded, the ignored, the undervalued, the judged. Just read Luke's gospel to see how he values them, how he values women, children, lepers, foreigners, outcasts. Look at how Jesus condemns the religious elite. He calls them hypocrites, whitewashed tombs, blind guides, blind fools, snakes, sons of vipers, men who abuse their power. That's pretty blunt. So what was the role of Nathan? Well, it was to challenge the most powerful man at that time, the untouchable David. So with wisdom, probably fear and trepidation, and a sense of justice and what is right in God's eyes, Nathan challenges David. Nathan tells a story of a poor man with a little lamb taken by a rich, powerful man who had everything. And when David expresses horror at what the rich man did, Nathan says, you are that man. God had given David wives, wealth, and power, but that was not enough. Nathan never suggests that Bathsheba did anything wrong. David treats Bathsheba as an object, not a woman, and he loses sons because of that lust. So what is God saying to us today? What is God saying with the Me Too movement as men of power and influence are being exposed for their lust and abuse? What is God saying to us with the rise of domestic abuse, particularly in the pandemic, where adults and children are abused sometimes for years, terrified and powerless? Even in Christian and church families, even families of ministers and clergy. What is God saying to us with Black Lives Matter, where those of us who are white have no idea what it is like to be constantly judged, hounded, condemned because of the colour of our skin? What is God saying to us today with the political elite who rule selfishly, even tyrannically, with no thought for others? One rule for them and another rule for everyone else. Think of Syria, Belarus, the United States, even the UK. And what is God saying to us even with the religious settings and Christian settings where there are those with power who abuse it and others, sometimes even in the name of God? So the challenge for us, are we prepared to see and acknowledge the injustices and abuses of power? Are we prepared to speak up and challenge the untouchables? Or do we settle for the half-truth that the powerful give us. God is love. God is truth. God is justice. God holds everyone, including us, to account. We cannot water God down. Let's accept his challenge today. Amen.